Excellent.
And yes, we are live. I'm here with Steve. How are you doing, Steve?
Good, David. How are you?
Do you mind if I call you Steve, or should I call you
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, absolutely.
Weidenkopf? Dr.
You
Weidenkopf?
got it.
Are you a doctor?
Yeah. No, I am not. No, I don't have a PhD.
Oh, okay. So you're Mr. Weidenkopf, is that right?
Correct.
Which
Yep.
is German for big head or something? Or what is
Yeah.
that?
Well, it can mean a lot of different things. I mean, Weiden actually is pasture or meadow in German. Kopf is head, so head of the meadow, head of the pasture, or translated, you could even translate as shepherd kind of thing. So.
Oh, wow.
Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah. Also, I've also heard. I mean, I don't know how true this is, but I've also heard that Weiden is a little flower that grows on some trees along the Rhine. And so we could also translate as flower head if you really wanted to, or head of the flower. That's what I've heard. But
Were you
yeah,
alive in 1969?
I was not.
You weren't alive yet. Okay, so you can't be
No,
Flowerhead.
no, yeah.
So I always ask my guests to start with a little biographical note, go back in
Hmm.
history, your own history. I know you like history, but you probably don't
Hmm.
talk about your own childhood too often. But just talk us through sort of what it was like realizing, that God exists, there's Christianity, and maybe your family was taking you to church. I don't know. You can talk us through the whole story. But from your earliest memories of God and religion, maybe they took you to
Hmm.
church, and then all the way through adolescence, and if there's any dark period, talk about that as much as you're comfortable. And then I don't know if you ever strayed from the faith or not, or if you dabbled in other worldviews. Give us
Hmm.
the highlights according to what you think is good, and then we'll get you right up to date.
Yeah, sure. So it was born in Cleveland, Ohio. So I'm a native Ohioan, I guess, but didn't live there for very long. So soon after I was born, it was towards the end of the Vietnam conflict. But my dad joined the Air Force, and we moved around all over the place. So military brat in a certain sense. We lived in multiple different states when I was young. But by the time I was 10, Dad got out of active duty, and we settled in upstate New York, central New York, Syracuse, New York, which is where my mom was from. And originally, my dad had moved to that area of the country during his junior year of high school from Cleveland. So the Weidenkopf family actually has a long history here in the U.S. I mean, the first ancestors came in 1837, so been here for a very long time from Germany, from Bavaria. Settled in Cleveland, Ohio, and the family lived there up until again my dad's parents, my grandparents moved to Syracuse, and it was from there that so my dad got out of the active duty Air Force. We moved to Syracuse, New York, and spent a couple of years there, and then eventually we relocated down to Texas. Spent numbers of years in Texas. My high school years were in Texas, and then I went to Syracuse University for my undergrad, back up into Central New York. So, and studied there for a bit, and that's where I really began to have a great love for. Well, I always had a great love, I should say, in my childhood for military history. So that's where my initial history love began. My grandfather was in the Army Air Corps during the Second World War, flew B-24 bombers in the Second World War. So I was always kind of drawn to him and to his experiences there in the Second World War. My dad being in the military as well, that had that focus for me. But at Syracuse, I kind of grew into a greater understanding of medieval history, Renaissance history, and really began to love deeply that period of time of history, and saw too that area of history really how much the church was involved in Christendom and in the history of Europe in particular. And so I was raised in a Catholic home. My mom was Catholic, my dad wasn't, but he eventually later converts when we were in Texas to the Catholic Church. And so, we always went to Mass. I have one sibling, a brother who's 10 years younger than me. So for a long period of time, I was an only child, if you will. But we always went to church every Sunday. But outside of that, we didn't really have an overly active participation in the faith. I wouldn't say it was something that overly inculcated our family life or anything like that. There wasn't really any kind of external prayers, as a family or anything like that. Wasn't discouraged, just wasn't, overly encouraged, I guess, as well. But it was actually while I was at Syracuse, which is a thoroughly secular university, was then so much so now that I actually grew into my faith on my own, which is kind of weird. Most people you hear they go to university and they lose their faith. Um, I would say that my faith actually increased a bit when I was in university. I continued to go to church, to mass at the Newman Center there on campus. And just again, the studying of history, especially the medieval period, really fostered this greater love and understanding of the faith for me, at least from an intellectual perspective. And then when I graduated, I came down to Washington, D.C., and started working for the federal government down here, and joined a local parish. And it was at that parish that I met a really great dynamic priest, whose anniversary of his death is actually tomorrow. But Father Ramey, so he died many, many years ago. But he helped me to really grow in my faith, and to the point where at one point I discerned a vocation to the priesthood, but quickly determined that wasn't God's path for me. Soon after that determination, I met my wife at our parish, and we got married soon after that, and God has blessed us with 6 beautiful children now. And so we've very actively live our faith in our family, raised our children to do so, and and along the way, I continued my love for learning. I got a master's degree in theology from the Christendom College Graduate School, and then came back later to teach, which is what I do now. So that's
Wow,
kind of
amazing.
the story in a nutshell.
Amazing. I looked up your bio so I could grab parts of it for my little bio that I put for people, and there was too much. I mean, it's just like you got too much too much going on. You're involved in a lot of stuff, and it's good. It's exciting. So your wife, I assume, was born and raised Catholic, or what?
She was, yep.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
nice.
she grew up in upstate New York, but we didn't meet there. We met down here in Virginia. So
Did you have a lot of aunts and uncles, and were any of them religious fanatics of any type?
no, actually, we both come from very small families. Myself in particular. I mean, my dad is an only child. My mom is one of 3 children,
Uh-huh.
all girls, and only one got married. I only have one cousin.
Wow.
And yeah, so not a lot of aunts and uncles and extended family. My grandparents, my paternal grandparents, who I was most closely affiliated with, they weren't Catholic. Most of our family wasn't Catholic, except from my mom's side. But yeah, never really grew up with any aunts, uncles, cousins, and that kind of stuff. So
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, I've
mhm.
got a ton of first cousins, but yeah, I don't hang out with them or see them or anything, but
Right.
they exist. So that's interesting. So it sounds to me, I mean, either you're just very modest and shy about talking about it, or you didn't have a dark period where you strayed or anything at all, right?
Yeah, not too much. I mean, after I graduated from Syracuse in my undergrad and moved down to this area, my first, I would say, serious girlfriend was a Mormon. So I had some time when I spent a lot of time talking to Mormon missionaries and learning about her faith and talking with her about that. And wrestling with some questions associated with that learning and that experience, and with my involvement with her, but never to the point where I seriously considered leaving the faith. I mean, questioning and did some things, obviously, but and just continued to investigate. But through that investigation, that was really a great blessing. You look back on it, right, from God, that it helped me to grow even more deeper into my Catholic faith and understand it and appreciate it more. And the one central thing, central doctrine, I should say, not thing, but central doctrine that really kind of rooted me in my faith, in my Catholic faith, was the Eucharist. That was the one thing that I just could not, um, not even I shouldn't say one thing. It was the one person that I really couldn't move away from, and couldn't imagine not having, if you will. And so that really, I think, rooted me. That and the Blessed Mother, her love for me and my love for her kept me Catholic, if you will, in that period of time, at least when I was investigating and questioning a lot. Yeah.
Are you pretty well grounded in metaphysics, philosophy, and all the sort of fundamentals of the rational component of your faith?
Yeah, I think so, very much. I mean, I'm not philosophy was not my best subject in graduate school, but yeah, I mean, I'm very much I think over the years, so first it was but definitely a rational perspective of understanding the faith, understanding the doctrines from an intellectual and metaphysical perspective. But then, I had a period of time where I worked for the church in the Archdiocese of Denver, where I was the marriage and family life director for a couple of years there, working for Archbishop Chaput. And when I moved there, we moved there, and I worked for the church there. I met just an amazing group of people, who most of whom I'm still very, very good friends with today. And they opened my eyes into a greater expression of our Catholic faith in terms of really, praying in a new way, in a more personal way, in a less rational, intellectual way, I would say, as I had done before. And, really showed me a way to further my walk along the journey in my relationship with those individuals, including Joe and Kathy Burns and Tim Gray and many other people we met out there. So, yeah.
Do you know any of the Catholics in Boulder, Colorado?
Some. I mean, I know of, Father Peter Mussett is big out there in Boulder. He was in seminary when I was out in the seminary, when I was out in Denver working for the church. And so, I'm sure he wouldn't remember me or know my name necessarily, but we were only there for a couple of years. But the people who still, there are many people who still live out there and work, especially with the Augustine Institute, who I am familiar with and who we're still friends with and stuff. Mm-hmm.
There was a student center there. I'm not sure if it was called the Newman Center or not, but nice building and a nice priest there, young guy. And he has a podcast with a friend. They do a podcast together. And it seemed like a really sort of good vibes, and like, always with this, when they're associated with students, they've got sort of a fun, youthful sort of atmosphere, and it's really nice. But my sister lives there. That's why I was in Boulder, because my sister lives there actually.
Okay. Oh, excellent. Yeah, great.
So you mentioned Bishop, you pronounced it Chaput?
Yeah, Archbishop Chaput. Mm-hmm.
Chaput. He has a very good reputation, right? Like I've heard his name kicked around quite a bit. Is it because, is he like Orthodox conservative? Is that how you say it when someone's like on the money?
Yeah, I would say that you could say he's fully Catholic. I would kind of put it that way. He's fully Catholic, he is, our Archbishop he's now retired. So he was the Archbishop of Denver when I worked for him, but then he moved many years ago he was moved to the Archbishop or the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. And so he was the Archbishop of Philadelphia for a number of years here. Before his retirement, I think he retired a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, maybe at most. So after, I was in Denver from 2001 to 2004. And then I think he moved to Philadelphia a number of years, 4 or 5 years or so after that, and then was there until he just retired. But yeah, a very holy, great man. I mean, he's written a number of different books on the faith. And, the thing with Archbishop Chaput that I think differs from a lot of prelates, especially in the United States, is that he truly was and is a teacher at heart. He's a catechist, really, at heart. He teaches the faith. He loves to teach the faith and explain it to others, which is why I think he's written so many books in a very accessible way, written for average Catholics and even people who aren't Catholic, right, to learn about the faith. A deep and loving faith. He's a Capuchin Franciscan, so he has a great love for Francis and for Jesus, obviously, in the church. But unlike many of the other bishops in the country who tend to be very, who have a legal background, right? Many of them go get their Canon Law degree, so they're more lawyerly. It's not a pejorative.
It's just very expensive to speak with them.
Yes, exactly. It's a good way to put it. Yeah. So they focus. They're a little different in how they approach things and how they approach their episcopal ministry. But Archbishop, I think, was unique, and people appreciate that about him because of his relationship with people, and the way that he teaches and talks about the faith. Yeah.
So you mentioned the sort of contrast between the intellectual journey and the heart journey, and I came into the faith from a really wild and dark journey from the age of 14 when I lost my faith in God. I was raised Protestant in a very liberal denomination, a denomination that has accepted atheist ministers, if you can believe that. The United Church of Canada, I don't know if you've heard about it. It united the Presbyterians and some other groups together way back in the day. But anyway, at age 14, I lost my faith. At age 39, I came back to the faith, and it was it was the saints. It was the lives of the saints, something very concrete and very historical, this is why I'm telling you, because I think you'd be excited to find out that there was an intellectual component, of course, discovering that God is God and that I'm not God. But the thing that I could really grab a hold of historically was the saints in the church. It's like, it's undeniable. If you just look at the facts, like what is, like in a court of law, just like who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, it's like pretty easy, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty easy. So I got a couple of random questions for you here before we dig into the history, okay?
Sure.
First of all, what is Mitch Pacwa like? He's one of my heroes. Is he a nice guy?
Oh yeah, Father Peck was great. Yeah, he's very down to earth, easy to talk to. He's a he's a bit of a character. So when you go down to EWTN and interviewed on the show there, you stay at a little guest house, and usually before the interview, he'll have you come over and chit chat a little bit about the interview, and then afterwards, sometimes he'll invite you back over to the house for an after interview drink kind of thing, and just sit and converse and have all kinds of fascinating conversations. So he's obviously a well-read, very well-educated man, and
Yeah.
great insight. And but yeah, he's definitely a character. So fun guy to be around.
Speaking of EWTN big personalities, what about Mother Angelica? Did you ever get the privilege of meeting?
No, I never got to meet Mother Angelica. Yeah, unfortunately. But
you liked her?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I remember even we talked about our faith and as or my faith as a kid, and even in Texas, my parents we had cable. We were able to get EWTN. I remember watching Mother Angelica on television, as a teenager in my home in Texas, and very surreal when I eventually got to her, the compound down there at EWTN to be interviewed about the books and meet Father Pacwa, who took over her show, really, in essence. And yeah, that was a neat experience. But no, never. Mother Angelica had already passed away by the time I got down there. So
okay. This next question is historical, but it's not in your wheelhouse. But I'm just curious because you said your family came over in 1837, right?
Yes.
That lies pretty much in the context of Father Schmet, Peter Schmet, I think it is, that I'm reading his biography right now. He was Belgian, a Flamand, like a Flemish Belgian young man, athletic man who was full of energy, and he left his family, who was a very good Catholic family, but he snuck onto a ship to go to become a missionary in America. And it's a fascinating biography. I hope it's true, because the reason I'm reading it is because I'm starting to feel just a little bit guilty about the way the Aboriginal peoples here have been treated by the white man. And someone said, well, just read this book, you feel a lot better. Because it talks about the Catholic Church in glowing terms. I mean, it's from a Catholic perspective, but I take it with a grain of salt because they might be lying to me. But I hope it's true. I hope it's true, because it sounds like the Native Americans appreciated the Catholics that came, the missionaries that came, and the government, and it sounded like, I don't want to bash the Protestants too much, but it sounded like the Protestants were sort of more antagonistic, and that the Catholics were more friendly and offering a lot of services in terms of education, healthcare, and religious services and stuff like that. Do you have any inkling whatsoever about that period of history in America and what happened with the Native people?
Oh, here not necessarily. I mean, that's definitely, as you mentioned, not my wheelhouse of specialty, but just generally speaking, I do think that much of the history of the church in North America is greatly exaggerated in terms of its negative history.
Black
I think
legends,
in terms of
stuff.
and things like that, and not only just in the Southwest with the Spanish, and for example, Saint Junipero Serra out in the California missions, who was resoundingly attacked. Despite very positive historical record of how he interacted with indigenous peoples, in the last several years in particular. Even you look at into the more eastern part of the United States, and even into Canada, right where you are, you had the North American martyrs with the Jesuits much earlier in the 17th century. But you read, for example, the work of the Huron relation of Saint Jean de Brebeuf. I mean, you don't get that sense, this negative sense that's usually presented in our modern day media about Catholic missionaries. You get the story from our modern media you get is Catholic missionaries, were all about trying to just Europeanize, if you will, the native peoples of this, of North America, to force them into accepting European ways of expressing the faith and that kind of thing, and treated them disdainly and things like that. And overwhelmingly, at least what I've read, is that that's not the case for most of the missionaries who came. Certainly true of many of the European colonists and settlers who came, who did mistreat indigenous peoples in the New World. But more often than not, they were met with resistance by church officials and clergy and missionaries who came here to evangelize, and the teachings of the church and the teachings of those missionaries weren't listened to by the colonists. So I think you're right in terms of, you want to be able to have an objective approach to trying to figure out what the real story is. And it's usually not always in one, glowing side, either pro or con. The truth is usually more complex and somewhere in the middle there. So we just have to always be aware of that and try to take things individually, and not broad brush things, right? Like say, Catholic missionary or the whole entire church was against Native peoples and this kind of thing, which is obviously not true. Or to say all, settlers and colonists, hated and mistreated indigenous peoples, don't think that's true either, obviously, right? But to try to get to the heart of the matter and look at individual stories and individual actions of people, I think is what's most important and necessary.
But you feel satisfied? Is it safe to call you a historian? Is that too much to say, or is it true?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Yeah, I mean, I've written a number of books. I teach history classes at the graduate level for Christendom College. So absolutely, yeah.
That's cool. So you're not frustrated, like thinking, oh, I wish I could really have been there to know what happened. I have to trust, I have to evaluate, and I'm never sure. You're not troubled by that at all?
No, because I think, I mean, here's, sure, there's elements of the discipline, obviously, that you have when you try to evaluate different texts and different perspectives of, what you're reading and what is being expressed by individuals in the past. But I'm really not someone who ascribes to some of the modern criticisms, of the past, and tend to look at things through, here's, I guess, a better way to put it is, everyone has a perspective. And so your honest historian, your honest writer of history you'll know their perspective up front. That doesn't mean that they're obfuscating facts, or, they shouldn't. It doesn't mean that they're trying to whitewash the story. It just means they're presenting the story of whatever it is they're writing about, with a certain perspective. And you have to be selective. Every historian recognizes that there's so many documents, there's so much information, so many sources, primary, secondary. You can't cover it all or talk about it all. You have to be selective. And you don't want to be selective to the point where you're trying to misguide the reader to a false impression of something, but you're obviously selective to trying to illustrate a certain point or to provide a certain perspective. And as long as you're upfront with that, and transparent about it, I think that's perfectly acceptable and fine. And there are many different conversations and debates that academics can have about trusting this source over that source, and whatnot, that the general public isn't going to really care about. And those are good and valuable discussions that need to take place. But at the end of the day, I really do ascribe to the notion that history is a story. It's the story of a people. It's the story of the church. It's the story of a particular event, and stories can be told from multiple different perspectives. The events can be described in a historically accurate and truthful manner, but then also presented in a different way to have a greater complexion, have a greater understanding of the complexity of the events you're trying to describe.
Thank you for that. So when you read the Old Testament and there's some battles in there, are you excited because you know something about military history so that you can understand maybe on a more nuanced level what the general or the leaders or these clan leaders had in mind when they had this particular tactic or this strategy? Do you get excited reading that Old Testament stuff, or is it just sort of like a childish summary that is presented to us in the Bible?
Yeah, I mean, Old Testament exegesis is not, again, my specialty, so I'm not going to comment more particularly on different battles or this or that, the historicity of various things. But I get more excited about, more military maneuvers and military tactics that I'm more familiar with, more of Roman military tactics and things like that, and even medieval battles, and armaments and things. So the Old Testament, not so much. I'm not as schooled or as knowledgeable about ancient warfare, at least that far in the past. But
does anyone specialize in that?
Old Testament warfare or ancient warfare? I'm sure they do. I'm not aware of those.
Small niche. Yeah. Small niche.
I think it would be. Yeah, Jewish military tactics of the first century or something, or the 400s BC. I'm probably not a good story, especially when the temple gets destroyed, by the Babylonians. But
yeah. Well, I always feel bad for that guy in the Maccabees, first or second Maccabees. I can never remember which one it is. He's like a bad guy, and he's the enemy of the Jews, and then he gets really sick and stinky, and he's rotting, and maggots are eating him as he was riding along on his chariot. Do you remember that guy?
I do. I think I remember the story. Yeah, you're talking about.
Anyway, I feel sorry for him because he seems like a nice guy. Like he was a bad guy, but then I think he repented. But the book says no, it was a false repentance. He didn't repent or whatever. But he wrote this nice letter to the Jews, like, "Oh, how are you? If you're doing well, if you're healthy and happy, that's what I want." And I realize now I've been humbled by God, and I want to be a Jew, and I want to be a good Jew and worship God. And like he's dying, right? But I believe him. Like, I mean, I believe him, but the Bible says, no, he's lying, he's not sincere, he's going to hell, this kind of thing. Is it possible that I'm right and the Bible was just sort of doing some propaganda campaign, or do I have to believe the spin that the Bible gave me?
Yeah. Well, I mean, good question. I'm not certain. I don't recall the exact story, so I can't. I would rather go back and want to comment and read it
Yeah.
in context and comment on it. But yeah, I mean, here's the thing with Scripture, right? So Scripture is obviously it's given to us what it teaches us about morality and about our faith and spiritual life is obviously authentic and true. And we know that there are historical events recorded in the scriptures. It's also true there is we believe in the historicity of scripture, and especially of the gospels, right? And so, but scripture plays a certain purpose, right? So scripture provides us with as Vatican Council II says, right? It firmly, faithfully, and without error teaches us those things we need to know for our salvation. So, and again, and all the books of the scripture are written, they're inspired, but they're written by human authors, and each human author presents and writes in a different genre for a different audience, for a different perspective. And so all those things have to be taken into account when we read scripture.
His name was Antiochus Epiphanes. I guess he was Antiochus the Fourth.
Sure.
And Wikipedia is painting him out to be a total villain and an enemy of the Jews, which is what the Bible says. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong about his conversion.
Yeah. Well, you can always hope. You never know, right? If it's not discussed, specifically, you can always hope for the best and hope for God's mercy in that situation.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So on to your specialty now, which is I'm very excited about. I'm going to ask you a couple questions, if you don't mind. Like, I mean, I'm sure you could just talk for days and days about what you want to talk about, but I'd rather pick your brain about what I want you to talk about. And so some of my favorite guys from the Middle Ages, some of my favorite saints from the Middle Ages, can you talk about, I'm sure anyone that you'll name will be one of my favorites, but one in particular that I really love is Saint Anselm. Is that too early for you?
No, yeah, Saint Anselm Canterbury, yeah. No.
Yeah, that's in your wheelhouse?
Sure. Yeah, a bit.
Going on? Do you know what was going on in England at the time? And he was struggling, I think, with his responsibilities as Archbishop of Canterbury. He wasn't too happy. Is that true? Like, do you know anything about what was going on? Was he more of a contemplative type that was put in an administrative role, or what?
Yeah, I'm not. Well, he was a monk, right? So I know that he was a Benedictine monk, if I recall, and so that's probably would be his focus. I'm not certain that he may have been overly excited about being, called out of the monastery to go be the Archbishop of Canterbury, especially because he was from France, right? So here he is in England, having to deal with new things and deal with the English king at the time, and he was a great writer, right? A great philosopher. He wrote many different works, right? Why God Became Man. He wrote the Proslogion, trying to explain the existence of God, or how to answer that question, rather. How do we know God exists? And so I think that probably was more of his focus, his intellectual pursuits, than more of his administrative aspects of things. But even going even further back in time to St. Augustine in the 4th century, right? He writes about that, about how he rather would spend his time praying and being in more deeper intimacy with God than having to do with all the administrative stuff associated with being Bishop of Hippo, of dealing with the governmental authorities, of dealing with people and all of their different petitions and requests and things like that. And it's burdensome. And having worked for a bishop, an archbishop in the modern age, on his staff, if you will, in the chancery, it's a thankless job in many ways, obviously, right? But the administrative aspect of it is overwhelming, and it's not true. If it's true today, it was true then, right? Or if it was true then, it's true today. It's the same kind of thing. So these good men who are called to be bishops, whether it's in the 11th century like Anselm, or whether it's in the 20th century like Archbishop Chaput, these are men who have a deep love for Christ and the Church, and that's their focus. And their focus is not, no one no good priest should desire to want to be some, glorified bureaucrat or administrator. And I don't mean to belittle bishops, by saying that, because
Yeah.
a lot of that is necessary. But, the true function of a bishop then is now is to preach and to teach and evangelize and to sanctify the people of God. And that's, the good ones really want to do that more than the other duties that they have to do. So.
Yeah. So, just a real quick side topic. You mentioned the duties and so forth. Have you read and studied canon law at all? Are you familiar with it? Are there things that you're excited about from that? Like, is it something that does it help you with your understanding of the church in terms of the history and all the like the administrative side, the hierarchy and the clergy and all that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you have a, I've not studied canon law, especially or anything, but yeah, but I'm familiar with it with, its growth and development, especially in the 13th century, and even, the current codification of the law. I mean, when I worked for the Chancery in Denver, I was the marriage and family life director, so I dealt a lot with marriage preparation. And there's certain canonical aspects associated with that, and had to work with the diocesan tribunal, especially for cases of nullity and things like that. So when people request, annulment or declaration of nullity from the church. So it's a necessary, right? The church is an organization, and it's an organization with a mission and a purpose. And that mission and purpose is obviously Christ's mission and purpose of, of evangelization and continuing his salvific mission in the world. But as any human institution organization that, it requires structure, requires, you know, what governance and guidance and laws and a legal structure to operate in the world. And so it's a necessary thing and it's a helpful thing, but you don't want to be too legalistic, right, or get too involved in the administrative aspects of things. It's a both and in pretty much everything in the church, right? You need the legal structure, but you also need the spiritual understanding, right? You need the mercy of God. You need to kind of and make sure that both of those work together and not one over the other.
Some critics of the Catholic Church want to say they want to look at the organic development of doctrine or changes in the liturgy and stuff like that. Even radtrads today, like the radical traditionalists and the so-called conservative Catholics, they want to make fun of me because I go to Novus Ordo Mass and these sorts of things. And I know there are sort of abuses or stretches that have come because of the Spirit of Vatican II, so-called. But it's obvious for anyone to see that we're not exactly at the height of the beauty of the liturgy in the Novus Ordo, even though I've read the 16 documents of Vatican II. It's very wonderful and it's very conservative.
Mm-hmm.
It's just been interpreted in a very loose way, and everyone's just doing whatever they want to do, basically. But like I've seen grave abuses here in Montreal, like where people, the lay faithful are allowed to intinct the body into the blood and stuff like that. It's like I just avoid those sorts of parishes. But it's everywhere. It's everywhere. Like there are abuses everywhere. So what my point is to you as a historian, like, do you see? You have a bird's eye view. Do you see that there are some things that must change, some things that are optional, and some things that can never change? Do you have a clear picture of that in your mind in terms of things like the administration, the liturgy, and even doctrine or disciplines?
Oh yeah. Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, and that's exactly what history provides, right? It provides that perspective, and the church has been around for 2,000 years, so there's a lot to a lot of perspective to gain from, and a lot of people to learn from, and a lot of examples to go back and look at. And I think with all the things you discussed, right, whether it's a small d discipline, a small t traditional thing in the church, whether it's liturgy, whether it's how we express the faith, whether it's various religious orders. I mean, whatever, it's a multitude of different topics you can look at on that. History provides that perspective and gives you examples to learn from, and that's exactly what my most recent book kind of looks at. Light from Darkness, you mentioned, is my recent book from Catholic Answers, where I take 9 times in the church's past where she was in great turmoil, great crisis of one element or another, and how those times of crisis, that's not the last word, right? That's not that period of darkness later on becomes, launches a reform, a renewal, or a revitalization of the church. And so God does bring the light out of those dark crises and dark times in church history. And that's the major point we can learn from studying church history. And I think it gives us a greater perspective on things, right? Is to not overly react in a negative way or have our faith shaken or become even more apathetic or, in our faith because of various, crises or instances or whatnot. And you mentioned it, in leading up to the question about, the liturgy is a very hot topic among, the Catholic community in the world today, and for good reason in many different situations. And I think that people. The other thing is that we need to have just a larger perspective too, right? We can say that in the Western world, in particular, the implementation of the Second Vatican Council, especially in the late '60s, '70s, '80s, '90s, was not great. A lot of things happened that allowed people to insert their own agenda, or their own interpretation of the council into the church, with various liturgical abuses and things like this, as you mentioned. But in other parts of the world, the decrees of the Second Vatican Council were implemented very effectively. In Eastern Europe, in Poland, where before Cardinal Wojtyla became John Paul II, it was very effectively implemented in Poland, and Africa as well, right? So in the Western world, Europe, United States, Canada, not necessarily, although pockets where it was. And so, again, it's as Catholics, we have to. It's hard, I think, for many of the people who comment on some of these subjects to keep in mind and to remember that the church is universal. It's much larger than the Western world, and we need to. I think we always need to remember that when we have these kinds of discussions.
Yeah.
We're very parochial, right, in how we see things, and that's understandable. But yeah.
You find yourself biting your tongue at the cocktail parties with normal hoi polloi?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I wouldn't describe people that way. But yeah, I mean, I get. You know how many times I frequently get asked questions about, is this, well, this one of the reasons why I wrote Light from Darkness, frankly, is because wherever last several years, when I go to parishes and give talks and this and that, it would always be asked, is this the worst time in church history? This has got to be the worst time in church history. And I would stare at people and say, really? I mean, like in the 10th century with Pope John the 12th, who died in bed with his mistress. I mean, that's what we're dealing with now is worse than that, or the Renaissance popes, or any the 11th century when you had monasteries were overrun with horrible sexual abuse and homosexuality and all kinds of nefarious practices. So much so that St. Peter Damian has to write a book called the Book of Gomorrah, which talks about how horrible things were in the monasteries in the 11th century. Really, that this is the worst time in the church's history? I mean, no. Are there difficulties in the church's life today? Sure. Has there ever been a period of time when there hasn't been difficulty? No. Why? Because the church has a human and divine element, obviously, to it. But the human element, which we focus on, obviously, in church history, in which we live and experience, is full of fallen yet redeemed creatures, right? Sinners. I mean, we're all sinners, and people in the church are sinners. Everybody's a sinner, right? And so we're redeemed, and we can live with the state of sanctifying grace in a holy and virtuous way. But that doesn't mean everybody chooses to do that, obviously, all the time. And so there's periods of darkness, but that's not the end of the story, right? We don't want to focus on the story. We focus on the light that is produced because of the darkness. Anyways, and so that was the whole reason for the book. So yeah, I frequently ask those kinds of questions, and I'm happy when people do, because I try to provide that level of understanding and perspective of, let's take a step back and let's look and see where we've been. Let's see where, and it's not to minimize the issues today. It's just to help us not overreact to them and to have a greater sense of hope and peace associated with what we're experiencing.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, not to dwell on this, but the rad-trads will say, or the sedevacantists will say, yeah, well, they were morally weak or whatever. That's not what we're talking about. The crisis today is that Pope Francis, or Bergoglio, or whoever they call him, Bergoglio's teaching heresy. He's a heretic, and he's teaching heresy, and he's leading the church into falsehood and he's false teaching. That's much worse than just, your sexual proclivities and letting yourself be a weak sinner. So that's what they say. What do you say to that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I say I don't think you can. Yeah. I don't think you can. Again, I focus more on history and not necessarily on the theological, doctrinal disputes. Although that's obviously part of church history. But I mean, usually how I handle this when people ask me about Pope Francis or they make comments about him is I try to again approach it from the perspective of a historian studying the lives of different popes living through different times, and say and try to tell them that look. I think Pope Francis gets a lot of criticism for not being for not being different than Pope Francis, right? What I mean by that is he gets criticism for not being John Paul II. He gets criticism for not being Benedict XVI. And I try to help people, or I talk to people and say, look, I mean, you're Pope Francis. You followed two of the greatest intellectuals of the 20th century, papacy, right? You followed John Paul II, who was one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. You follow Benedict XVI, who's one of the greatest theologians, I think, in the 20th century. And then you, and this is not to diminish Pope Francis, or his intellectual capabilities at all. He's a Jesuit. He's not a stupid man. But he has a different background, different culture, different area of the world he grew up in, different political, nature and political environment that he experienced and grew up in as well, from the two popes who preceded him. And where the previous two popes may have been more pro-democracy, pro-capitalism, pro-Western in their outlook and their approach and their discussion, and even more importantly, more precise in how they talk about the faith, Francis is not that, right? He doesn't have those gifts. He doesn't speak precisely. Is that a valid criticism? In many ways. Is that a valid criticism about his pontificate? Yes, I think that is a valid criticism, right? There are times when he should be more precise in the way in which he talks about doctrines and the faith and the church than he is. Okay, but that doesn't mean that he's a heretic. That doesn't mean that he's leading the church into heresy or schism or this or that. Does he govern differently as Pope than these two men before him? Sure, he does. Again, why? Because of many different reasons, right? His background, his focus, his goals of his pontificate, how he sees his role in the church is very different. That's, but if you study the history of the church in the exercise of papal ministry, it has evolved and developed over time, and the understanding of it and the use of it and the application of it has developed and has been applied in many different ways and by different popes through many different centuries of the church. So just because Francis doesn't meet your vision of what you think, the Pope should be, doesn't mean he's a heretic, doesn't mean he's a bad Pope.
Can you imagine a man, okay, let's say he was unfortunate, his first wife died, his second wife died, his third wife died, and the fourth wife is like always being compared with the other wives? The cooking, how she cleans, how she talks, like how she snores, whatever. It's just like,
right.
That's not going to end well. Okay, this one's going to end in divorce because it's not how you treat a human being. It's just not how you treat a human being, period.
Right.
So
no, but I think so. Yeah, I just think, sorry to interrupt. I mean, I think we just need to, and many people need to, and I don't, again, mean to belittle any of the conversations or very serious topics that people, want to discuss about, which are all valid, in many ways, but, a little more charity, right? And how I think we talk about our Holy Father is always, and just one more plug, right? In my book, Light from Darkness, that my last chapter is I provide a case study of how Catholics can respond to living in a time of crisis in the church. And in the two historical case studies I use, there are St. Catherine of Siena, who lived in a very difficult time during her own life with the Avignon papacy and the return to Rome. And then after that, the Great Schism, where you had two different men claiming to be Pope, and eventually there would be three. And then I contrast her with Savonarola, this 15th century Dominican friar who lived during the time of the papacy, Renaissance papacy, during the time of Pope Alexander VI, who's the kind of poster child for the bad popes during the Renaissance papacy, and who criticized him severely. Savonarola did, Alexander, but Savonarola believed that the reform needed to be applied according to his dictates, according to his plan. And if you didn't accept Savonarola's opinion, then you were bad. You were a heretic. And Catherine of Siena never says these things, right? Who does she say it has the plan? It's Christ's plan. It's his church, where we follow him. She never lost her faith in him. She never put her faith in men, never put her faith in politics, whereas Savonarola did. And that's the danger that we can get ourselves into when we start to criticize the church, the Holy Father, our bishops too severely, as we can put ourselves in the path to be Savonarola, who ended up being burned at the stake and his ashes thrown into the river in Florence. Not by the church, but by the secular authorities of Florence. But or we don't want to be on that path. We want to be on the path to sanctity that St. Catherine had. So
yeah, she called the Pope, who was a weak man, our sweet Christ on earth, sweet Christ on earth.
Yeah.
So what about Saint Joan of Arc? She's like 14th, 15th century, something like that. 15th century.
15th century.
Early 15th century. She's always been one of my heroes. This is a case study for how the church can sort of, I don't know at what level, but the church can condemn someone and then later beatify them. Can you just talk me through that? Like what is that? That's not the first time, it's not going to be the last time, but when the church is hostile and then softens a few decades or centuries later, what is the process there? Is it just because the church is conservative and it wants to be very careful at first and then it evaluates? Is that what's happening?
Well, sort of. So the thing with Joan of Arc we have to remember is, again, so saints live in historical times, right? In historical periods, they're historical people, and so there's obviously things that are going on around them in their lives that transcend them, but that also help to explain, their own lives. And so obviously, what's happening with Joan in the 15th century is this is towards the end of the Hundred Years' War between England and France. England has really conquered most of French territory, has control of many different cities, or is at least attempting to control them through various sieges, like Orleans. Paris has been captured. So she lifts the siege of Orleans. That's where she becomes known as the Maid of Orleans for lifting the siege. And she marches on to Paris and tries to capture Paris. Doesn't succeed there. Eventually gets to Compiègne, where she's captured by the Burgundians, who were French but not aligned with the crown. And then they sell her, in essence, really, they give her to the English. And so it's a French bishop, Bishop Pierre Cauchon, who is in collaboration with the English. So he's not a royal supporter. He's not a supporter of the king. He's the one who takes Joan to Rouen, and it's there where he tries her for heresy. And so it's Bishop Cauchon. So when you say the church, this is where we have to, again, be more specific and realize it's not the papacy, it's not the universal church, it's one element of the church. I mean, in this particular case, it's one bishop who's an English collaborator who wants to get rid of Joan, who proceeds against her in very irregular manners. And when you study and look at the trial of Joan, you see that there were highly improper procedures that were followed by Bishop Cauchon. Her appeal, one of which was after she was, given her abjuration to sign, she did sign it, and then she later recanted it. She appealed her case to Rome, which should have been allowed. It was not. She was charged with heresy under his tribunal, under his court, Cauchon's court, and his investigation. But she was allowed to receive the sacraments before she was handed over to the secular authorities and burned at the stake, which was highly irregular for a so-called, relapsed and unrepentant heretic to do that. She also, was placed in a secular jail rather than ecclesiastical jail. So if you were tried with an ecclesiastical crime during the time, and heresy was initially, you should have been under the jurisdiction of the church and in ecclesiastical jail, which with those conditions were much, on average throughout Christendom, were much more humane and charitable and better than secular jails. But she wasn't. She was kept in a secular jail under English guard, English armed guard. So those were all massively irregular aspects of her trial. And then, the condemnation was passed by Cauchon, and she was turned over to the secular authorities, English, and burned. He was present at her execution, which was also highly irregular. It was forbidden under canon law for clerics to be at the execution of an unrepentant heretic by the secular authorities. So multiple different problems with that trial. And with its ultimate conclusion, which is why once the English finally were kicked out of France, France was restored, or most of it restored under royal control, that the king first, Charles, who he then opened up his own royal investigation of what happened with Joan and the proceedings against Joan, compiled a report, and then later the Pope also opened up his own tribunal. And then utilizing some of the documents that were collected during the royal investigation, then their own investigation as well. And eventually Joan was rehabilitated and illustrated and proven to not be guilty of what she was accused of by Cauchon. And then much later, not until the 20th century, was she then actually canonized by Pope Benedict XV. So in some cases you can say it was a long process of which things were investigated properly, documents were reviewed, the church took its time to review that to make sure that it was making an accurate statement, but again the initial tribunal and investigation was highly irregular, and so we always have to keep that in mind, that it was instituted by Cauchon, by this English collaborating bishop, and not the focus of the papacy or the larger church as a whole.
Is that an example of corruption? That cochon? Is it cochon like pig or cochon something else?
Oh, I don't know if it's pig. It's Cauchon. Is that pig in French?
I think so. Yeah.
Cochon.
Unless no, cochon is probably cochon, pig in French. Let me just check the spelling. Pig in French. Cochon. Cochon. Okay, so different word. Different word. Okay, so he's not a pig. I thought that would be ironic.
No, well, that'd be kind of interesting wordplay, though. Yeah.
But was he an example of corruption in the hierarchy? Would you say at that time?
Well, I wouldn't make such a generalized and blanket statement as that. I mean, the blanket statement is that I would say that
what motivated him? What motivated him?
Yeah, power, prestige.
Sounds like corruption.
backing the. Well, I wouldn't say. Yeah, I mean, were there French bishops who were aligned with the English forces and wanted England to prevail in that conflict? Sure, because they stood to gain, right? As other people would stand to gain. Were there bishops that sided with the Charles and who's Dauphin at the time, and then later anointed king, with Joan's lifting of the siege of Orleans? Yeah, I mean, so it's one of those complicated situations in life where you have men who are pursuing their agendas based on different personal things that they're going to gain from it. So he probably, if you go back in time and talk to Bishop Cauchon, does he think he's doing the right thing with getting rid of Joan? And would it also serve many goals and personal ambitions that he has? Sure. Would we still condemn him for those actions even at the time? Yeah, we should. But that was his perspective, as wrong as it was.
I don't know how you'd know this, but do you think that Saint Joan of Arc would have been canonized as a saint if she hadn't met that challenge and that death? Or like, was she living a holy saintly life anyway? She would have been canonized anyway. Is that the impression you get from reading her life?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, it's kind of a hard question to answer because I think her life was intimately linked with the with the political and military events that she oversaw and that she participated in, right? So with the absent those, would she have ever been known, right? Would she have ever risen to the recognition on such a wide level that her life would have such great difficulty and great events associated with it that later on, through her rehabilitation and the devotion that the French had for Joan, through the centuries, would she have eventually been canonized? Absent her participation in those events, if she just remained like a small shepherd, or small French peasant child, through the 15th century, would we ever known of Joan of Arc? Probably not. Right?
Yeah. So, what I'm really driving at here is, if we were to explain to a young child, if they said, "Why is Saint Joan of Arc a saint? Why was she canonized?" Would we be able to say because she was fighting for the church against the enemies of the church? Is that the perspective, like simplified? Is that what happened? Is that why she's canonized? She was fighting for the church and for God against the enemies of church and God? Is that what happened?
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, from a French perspective, the French would say yes, she was. From an English perspective, maybe not, right? So no, I mean, people. Here's the thing: is that we should tell children, because it's true, that people are canonized or recognized as saints because they lived a holy, virtuous life and because they loved Christ and the church. That's really why anybody becomes a saint, right? Why they're recognized as being saints is because of their intimacy and their love for God and the things they do for God. Not because of anything they write, or not because of anything. We can appreciate, for example, right, the writings, obviously, of Thomas Aquinas, other intellectually great saints, but there's been a lot of theologians in the church's history, a lot of intellectuals who've written about the faith. They're not all canonized saints. Why is that? Because Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, others like them, illustrate, not just through their writing, but by their life, their deep level of sanctity and the devotion that people have to them because of that sanctity. So Joan, obviously a heroine to the French people because of her political and military activity and what she was able to accomplish for France, recognized by them because of that, and obviously who she was, holy, right? She said that this was a mission given to her by God, not something that she did herself, that she received, visions and messages, divinely so, to be able to do what she did. And so she obviously had to be close to God in order to receive those visions and that mission. And so she was virtuous and holy. So that's something that we can emulate and imitate, as we should, right? Of all the saints. And so that's why she ultimately, I would say, was canonized, because of her spiritual life, wrapped up as it was in the great political military events of her day. Now, Warren Carroll, the founder of Christendom College, where I teach, is in his History of Christendom series. He asks the question, well, why did Joan need to occur? Why did God give her this mission? Right? It's obviously this is speculation, right, on his part, but I think it's a very interesting speculation. So his speculation on why this happened and why Joan, was brought into this story by God, why he used her as his instrument for this. Why would God care about the political and military events of 15th century France? His take on that was that by keeping Joan and her life and the events that it produced kept France French, prevented the English from holding France and turning it English, if you will. And so Warren Carroll says that his take on it is that when you fast forward several centuries to the time of Tudor England, Henry VIII, when Henry separates from the Pope in Rome in 1534, that prevented, if England had conquered France, if Joan hadn't been successful in her mission, then a huge swath of land and an immense peoples in Europe would have broken away from the church. There would have been this great divide, between Italy, the elements of the Holy Roman Emperor to the east, and then you have Spain to the west would remain Catholic, but then right in the middle would be a large nation that would turn Protestant. And how much different would church history be? How much different would the history of Europe be had that occurred? So his take is that Joan happened, and God gave her that mission in order to solidify the faith in France, at least during that tumultuous time of the 16th century. Now, obviously, we know later on in the 18th century, you have the French Revolution and all kinds of things happening in France. But at least during a very rocky time in church history, France was preserved and kept Catholic. And he links it to Joan of Arc. So, yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. Thank you for that. My friend who goes by Gateway is in the chat. He says, howdy, thanks to Steve for the glory of the Crusades. So I think he has it. Maybe he's even read it, but he seems to be a fan. So that's a shout out to my friend Gateway. I want to ask you, I really want to dig into the meat and potatoes, but I don't want to abuse your time either. But Scotus, Blessed John Duns Scotus, was not canonized because they found scratch marks inside of his coffin. I don't think that's fair, but I think he's a saint. But anyway, whatever. What's your impression of Blessed John Duns Scotus? Do you like him?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know. I know the name and know a little bit about him, but I don't know as much about him. Yeah, and so I can't comment fully on it, sadly. But
yeah.
Yeah. Like I said before, there are many. Like I said, I mean, there are many people who wrote, throughout the church's life, very different theological treatises and tracts and books, and they wrote very well, even, right?
Yeah.
But aren't canonized. So
yeah. I mean, I struck gold when I asked you about Saint Joan of Arc. I was just rolling the dice there, and it paid off. So I took a chance with Scotus, but I've got so many questions here. I'll sort of, I guess this is a quick question. We won't spend time on it. Ukraine, Russia today, there's some kind of something's happening there. I don't know what it's, a war, what it is. I guess it's been like a year now. I'm cheering for Russia and the East against the sexual perverts in the West who want to corrupt all the children. So that's sort of my oversimplified view of Russia versus Ukraine. Do you share do you have any sympathies for my simpleton point of view on that? And what do you think is actually happening there?
Yeah, no, I mean, other than following it and knowing that there's a conflict going on there, I'm not, I don't really have any particular opinions of
You don't
the matter,
have
frankly,
any secret information about what's going on?
I don't.
They're persecuting the Orthodox in Ukraine. They're like just kicked them out.
I didn't know that. Well, I know. I mean, I didn't know that, but I know that there is some pretty nasty history, right, associated between Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah.
Especially in the 20th century, just even with Stalin and forced collectivization and the famine that occurred. So where millions of Ukrainians were killed by Soviet Russia. So those two peoples don't love each other and like each other. So along with many other areas of the world.
So maybe it's naive for me to hop on board with Putin and the Russians against the Ukrainians since they've been mistreated.
Yeah. I would say just in most conflicts, right, of human history, they're both,
Two sides of the coin.
virtuous. Yeah. Well, there's both virtuous actors and unvirtuous actors, right, on both sides. And so life and like history and war, sadly, is much more complex than just, this guy is good and that side is good and that side is bad. And we have to root for that side over this side. And at the end of the day, we should be rooting for peace.
Yeah.
And for an end to end to hostilities, and,
of course,
and
it's
because
the
innocent people are being killed, right?
Yeah, they're suffering and being killed. But what I see at stake really is like the West with all their sexual perversion and all this sort of godless selfishness. They're pushing all like abortion and same-sex stuff and whatever, and just like it just seems like blatantly satanic. And the East seems to be clinging on to God and tradition and religion and that sort of thing. So to me, that trumps any sort of historical pattern about, Russia was nasty back in the day or whatever. Like it just trumps that, because even if they're just pretending to be Christian, like if Putin's pretending to be Christian, but I have insider information that he frequently goes to see the monks in Greece, in Halkidiki, and that he is a deeply religious man. So that gives me some hope. But do you know what I'm driving at here with when it comes to the culture wars and the decadence of the West? Doesn't it nauseate you?
Yeah, I mean, so does it nauseate me? I mean, yeah, there's obviously aspects of our Western society and our especially moral topics that obviously are not in keeping with the church's teachings and not in keeping with decency and human nature, right? So, and natural law. So yeah, that bothers me. I think the answer to it, though, is not a political answer. There's not a military answer. It's an evangelistic answer. It's a conversion answer, right? We need to return to Christ. We need to be rooted in Christ, and I think the best way that we as Catholics can help change our world and help change our Western culture that has been, we could say, right, hijacked by certain very vocal. I still believe that they're minority elements, but they're vocal and powerful minority elements that are pushing radical agendas. That the best way to combat that is through personal evangelization, personal witness, and trying to be the best Christians that we can be to everyone who God brings into our life, and to raise our children to be that as well, and to reclaim and reclaim and re-evangelize our culture. The
family is where it starts with education and everything else. The Freemasons show up a lot in the apparitions of Mary. Quito, Ecuador is a good example. There are many examples where the Freemasons are revealed to be sort of on God's radar as enemies of the church. Did they begin in the 18th century? Is that too late for you? You didn't really study them too much?
Yeah, and I haven't delved too deeply into Freemasonry outside of just understanding that, obviously they're very anti-Catholic, especially in its European manifestations in the 18th century, and many people try to ascribe various things, to them, or especially use them as characters in stories, along with the Knights Templar. And
yeah,
looking at you, Dan Brown. But so yeah. Outside of that, I don't know a whole lot about their origins or their own particular history, but know that the church, has obviously still, disciplined, a law on the books that no Catholic can be a member of the Freemasons. I do know that. So, but yeah.
Automatic excommunication.
Yep.
I talk about the glorious Crusades and the glorious Inquisition. The Inquisition is something that I often wish we could have. You can clarify the actual historical reality of it for me. But I'd like people like Trudeau here in Canada and Biden in the States to be stamped as non-Catholic rather than Catholic, because it just gives a bad name to Catholics. So, I mean, I don't mind if you're not a Catholic, that's fine. Just don't call yourself a Catholic, So the Inquisition for me would be like a way of clarifying, okay, you're claiming to be Catholic, so therefore you have to believe this, 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 and this, and this, and this, and this. Do you believe it? No. Okay. Well, here, are you open to education? Like, is that what the Inquisition was about? And is it something that we could do again?
Yeah. So, how much time do we have?
I have all the time. You're the bottleneck on the time. So yeah.
I think I teach an entire course on the Inquisition, frankly. But so yeah, so we're going to start with the Inquisition. So for a couple of things we have to understand, with the historically speaking, at least, about the Inquisition, right, is that it really, we could describe it in two different phases and two different stages. So historically speaking, the first phase is really what more appropriately is called papal inquisitors, the time of papal inquisitors or medieval inquisitors. So this is the time in the early 13th century with the Albigensian heresy in the south of France. And the Albigensians were a group of at that point, neo-Manichaean kind of Gnostic group, right? That matter is bad, the spiritual life is good, and all the other kinds of doctrines they held that were heretical. And so the medieval inquisitors were created as a way to help deal with that heretical problem in the south of France. Now, backing up a little bit before that, so before the late 12th century, right, the church never had any kind of universal, comprehensive way in which it dealt with heresy. Heresy was dealt at a local matter, as a local matter. So usually, in some cases, like doctrinally with bishops, but more often than not, by the 12th century, it had devolved into the hands of secular authority. The secular authority really kind of maintained peace and order and security in the realm. Heretics, if you study the heresy or the history of heresy, it always breeds violence. And so secular rulers are concerned with maintaining peace, order, security, and free exchange, commerce, and these kinds of things in their realm. And so they don't want unity of society, which was rooted in Christ and rooted in the church, rather, at that time in Europe, to be disrupted. So, but as we get later into the late 12th century and into the 13th century, then you begin to see that, and the church begins to realize that local authority, secular authorities in particular, are not schooled enough in doctrine or to understand the church's teachings and to really know whether somebody's a heretic or somebody's not, whether somebody is opining on a matter that is legitimate to opine on, or whether they're truly preaching something and teaching something that is heretical and antithetical to the faith. So you take that perspective along with, at the time, this revolution in jurisprudence and legal matter and legal procedure in Europe at the time, this kind of rediscovery or reapplication, if you will, of Roman imperial law, at least within the church, and the development of the decretals of Gratian and Canon Law, begins to create this legal understanding of a change in procedure where European criminal justice, if you will, up until the 12th century, was really more rooted in accusatorial procedure rather than inquisitorial procedure, right? So accusatory procedure was, if I think my neighbor, committed a crime, I go to my lord and I say in his, local manor court, and I accuse my neighbor of doing something wrong. That's accusatorial procedure. The neighbor is brought before the secular lord and is asked to swear an oath. Did you do what Steve is accusing you of? You say no. Steve says yes. Then the ruler either decides, or I can challenge the individual, the one I've accused, to a trial by combat or trial by ordeal, some kind of ordeal. So this is where the whole sense of dueling or of walking through going through some kind of ordeal, like walking through fire or putting your hand into boiling water or being submerged in water for a period of time. This is where the sense of ordeal and God's justice comes from, because it was rooted in accusatorial procedure. But that changes in the late 12th century, when this revitalization of Roman jurisprudence becomes more focused in the church, and then from the church seeps out into secular courts as well, though it was first really maintained within ecclesiastical courts. Which brings up a whole other topic that I should have started with as well, is that during this time in European history and church history, you have two kind of systems of law, right? Two systems of jurisprudence, two legal entities. You have secular law, secular courts, and you have church law and church courts. We still have ecclesiastical courts today. I mentioned that earlier in our conversation, but more often than not solely, but more predominantly, they focus on cases of marriage and marriage tribunals and those kinds of things, right? But canon law extends to much more than just whether or not a marriage is valid. So we still have ecclesiastical courts and tribunals today, but their subject matter is much more limited than it was in the time of 12th century Europe. So you have two different court systems, two different legal systems. You have this change in legal procedure now to inquisitorial. An inquisitorial procedure is an authority will go and investigate an alleged crime, gather evidence, and then inquire to someone who that evidence points to might be accused of a crime as to whether or not they are guilty of that crime. And that's a whole different procedure than accusatorial, where the state or the secular authority or the church authority doesn't investigate. Somebody comes and accuses, right? So it changes the perspective. So that you have the Albigensian heresy arise. Pope Innocent III calls a crusade to try to put this down. It's really not that successful. It just turns into a nasty, bloody civil war in the south of France, where the ultimate goal or the ultimate impact of it was the French king who gains more control over an area of France that he really didn't have control over before. But the heresy still persisted. So then the church responded to the heresy being still in existence after the Civil War, the Crusade, was the establishment of these papal inquisitors to go, and they were itinerant at first. So they would go to different areas where there were reports of heresy, or they would go to Albigensian strongholds where they knew where those were, and they would establish their tribunal. They would, open the doors, if you will. They would preach. These medieval inquisitors would preach about, God, the church, and Jesus, the faith, truth, what correct doctrine is, and then they would have a period of grace, they called it, anywhere from 30 to 40 days, where you could come and self-incriminate to the inquisitors. You could say, I'm an Albigensian, I believe their doctrines, I think it's true, but I know that that's wrong. I've heard you preach, and I want to repent. I want to be restored to the church, to communion with the church. So if you did that, then the inquisitors would give you some kind of penance, right? Usually with some, depending on your station and how much involved you were, the penance would vary.
Would it just be prayers? Would it just be prayers like what I get?
It could be prayers. It could be, if you were like a nobleman, it could be something even more substantial, where you could, be asked to provide funds for the building of a church or some kind of public project or something like that. Something that would really be penitential for you based on your station in life. Yeah. In some cases in that time, even going on crusade was given as a penance.
No way.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Which is pretty heavy right now. The 3 or 4 Hail Marys we say now is a little different, right? The penance is a little bit lighter, which is both good and bad in some cases. But yeah, so after the period of grace, then the period of time would open of accusation, where people could come before the tribunal and say, I think Steve's an Albigensian. And then the inquisitors would investigate that. I would be called before them. I could give testimony. I could call witnesses that would corroborate my story. One of the things that they did initially too was I provided the inquisitors a list of my enemies, and anybody who came then and accused me, who gave testimony against me, who was on that list, their testimony would be thrown out. And I wouldn't be known. I don't know who came and testified against me. They tried to protect the people who did from any kind of retribution. But and then you go through the process, and ultimately at the end, if you would have multiple times throughout the investigation and the trial to repent, to recant, to return to communion, to say you're sorry, to receive a penance. And if at the end of the day, if you refuse to do that after a period of time, and again, multiple opportunities to recant and repent, if you refused, if you were unrepentant, then you were turned over by the inquisitors to the state. You were remanded to the state. Because at the time, heresy was a dual crime. It was a secular crime as well as an ecclesiastical crime. So canon law prohibited the death penalty. So the church could not put anyone to death under canon law and in their courts for heresy. But in secular law, at the time, heresy was a capital crime. So it was punishable by death. So when the inquisitors went through their process, at the end, if the person was still an unrepentant heretic, they were remanded to the state. The state would then try them, and if the state convicted them of heresy, which they would because they had been already shown to be so from the ecclesiastical court, then the state would be the one who executed the heretic under secular law. So this whole notion that people have, which is a huge mischaracterization and misunderstanding of the Inquisitors and the Inquisition in the Church's history, that the Church killed, I've seen all kinds of different estimates, thousands to tens of millions of people for heresy or for thinking differently or for not being allowed to express their free thought, is historically false. It's completely inaccurate. That's not what happened at all.
Was everyone sort of supposed to have been Catholic at that time, or were there other religions and they
Oh,
just
yeah.
let those people be, like the Muslims could be Muslims or whatever?
So right. In certain areas of Europe and Christendom at the time, you had Muslims, mostly in what is modern day Portugal and Spain, but in other areas as well. And then you also had communities of Jews, right, throughout Europe as well, throughout Christendom.
They weren't
But
subject
outside
to
of
this treatment, right?
Nope, nope. Both actually, the Jews and Muslims were not subject to any papal medieval inquisitors because heresy, only baptized Christians were under the jurisdiction of the medieval inquisitors and then later the institutional tribunals, because heresy, the definition, is it's a post-baptismal obstinate denial of the doctrine of faith, right? So post-baptismal, you have to be baptized in order to be accused of heresy. Jews and Muslims cannot be accused of heresy.
And you can't be baptized against your will if you're an adult.
Correct. Yes.
So my friend Gateway says, question for later, what does Steve think about Islam's origins? Is it largely from Arian, Nestorian, and Ebionites? He also says, what also does Steve think about the thesis that Islam is the fulfillment of Genesis 16:12, that the Ishmaelites would be great nations that oppose their brothers, Jews and Christians, from Isaac? The Quran 5 verse, 551 says specifically not to take Jews as Christians as friends, for they are friends of each other. It affirms the opposition that is written of in Genesis. So those are some ideas for you to play with Islam. I don't know if you're really if this is your wheelhouse or not, but do you have any guess about the origins and sort of the prophecies about Islam arising? It seems like it might fit in there somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I have some facility and some understanding of Islam. I mean, at least in relationship to studying it with the Crusades. But and so Islam, I guess the origins of it, right? There's and actually this is a very hotly contested topic in certain areas of academia right now. Of who was Muhammad? Was there really a Muhammad? Did he really exist? Was he an actual historical person? How much of the traditional Islamic narrative about Muhammad and the origins of Islam, how much of that can be actually trusted? How much of it can be ascertained? There's all kinds of different debates about that. People will say things like the first biography of Muhammad wasn't written until centuries or so after his death, if you will. There's no contemporary accounts that help us to corroborate much of the Islamic narrative about the origin of the religion as well as Muhammad himself. Primarily because, again, the people of the Arabian Peninsula at the time didn't really write many things down at that. They were very nomadic at the time. So there's that. I mean, I think it's much later on, actually, in Islamic history where there's this linkage and tie to their origin with this prophecy of Abraham and Ishmael and that whole situation. It's a later understanding and a later accretion to Islamic tradition and Islamic narrative history. So one thing we have to understand with Islam too is that it was very much it's a compilation of what existed on the Arabian Peninsula at the time, right? The Arabian people at the time were pantheistic. They believed in a multitude of different gods, 360 gods in particular. Yeah, polytheistic, absolutely. And so there's that, right? There's that aspect. So there's parts of it there. There were Jews on the Arabian Peninsula at the time as well. And so there's a little bit of, Old Testament and Judaism understanding. There were Nestorians, Nestorian Christians living in the Arabian Peninsula at the time as well. So there's a great understanding of Muhammad, or at least Islam, early Islam, taking a lot from these different areas and groups and kind of mashing it together. So if you're, a Star Trek Next Generation fan, I always liken it to Islam is like the Borg, right? They just kind of assimilate things and take things that already exist and assimilate it together. And resistance is futile. So as the Borg say, so that's I think a good kind of analogy to help us understand at least some of the origins of Islam, if you will. But
interesting. Have you heard about David Wood and Robert Spencer? These are two sort of anti-Muslim,
Yeah,
or not
I
anti-Muslim, but
know.
anti-Islam.
Yeah, I know Robert Spencer. David Wood, I'm not familiar with. Spencer, I am in many of his works. Yeah.
I'll be interviewing him on Monday, Robert Spencer. I don't know him, but
Oh, fantastic.
I just discovered that he has this jihad watch, whatever
Hmm.
it is.
Hmm. Yep.
And I'm not really fond of the idea of sort of opposing another religion and just focusing on that, but whatever, maybe that's just an academic specialty, I don't know. But I think
Mhm.
Robert Spencer, I think he converted to Orthodoxy, or was he born and raised Orthodox? I don't know, I'm going to find out on Monday. But
I think so. Yeah, yeah, ask him about that because I do know that there's some things. I know he was Catholic, or he was
was he
Catholic.
Catholic at one
He
point?
was Catholic, yeah, and yeah. So Catholic Answers, who's published many of my books, has published at least one book of his.
Okay, so he's not like kryptonite, like too hot to touch. He's not like very controversial because of his
No,
anti-Islam.
yeah, he's yeah. I would say when he was writing and he was more active, at least when I was more aware of him many years ago, I think there were some people who were some groups that were very uncomfortable with him. I know, ask him about this. I know when he was invited to speak at certain places and certain dioceses, invitations were revoked
Oh,
later, that he wasn't allowed to speak in the diocese. And so I think there was some among certain members of the hierarchy, maybe some uncomfortableness with how he presented things and how he talked about things with Islam. So I would
yeah,
definitely ask him about that as well. So it's
yeah.
just my very surface understanding of it. But
I have a strange attitude myself toward non-Catholic religions like Judaism and like current day Judaism and Islam and stuff like that, because I read Vatican II, and I love the way that it treats of the means of salvation. All of the means are within the visible boundaries of the Catholic Church, but there are also means
mhm,
of salvation outside of her visible boundaries, and those all tend to bring people back into the fullness of the faith. And so, on the one hand, I have a very soft ecumenical approach to any non-Catholic. On the other hand, I mean, we have to call a spade a spade. In modern day Judaism, missed the boat. They missed the Messiah, their own Messiah. They missed their own Messiah. Like, we have to just call a spade a spade. And Islam is just wrong historically about the early what happened 2,000 years ago. They're just wrong, right? I
right.
mean, nothing could be more obvious to a historian, I think, than that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's true. I mean, yeah. So yeah, I think that many people, going back to kind of this conversation of the differences of speaking about Islam and whatnot, is that I think in today's day and age, we try to talk about those differences in less antagonistic ways, right? Than they may have been talked about and discussed in the past. So that's I think kind of what Lumen Gentium and other documents of Second Vatican Council are trying to get at there in our relationships with others. Yeah.
My friend says that Robert Spencer was poisoned when he tried to visit Iceland. He was actually poisoned. I don't know
Oh,
if that's
geez.
true.
I know that's not good, but yeah.
Wow,
Um,
incredible. So
yeah.
one last question. I'll let you go just because I've really been abusing your
Sure.
generosity here, but I really do appreciate it. You're really a wealth of knowledge, and I'd like to have you come back and talk to me some more. It's because of Peter. It's because of Michael
Michael.
Lofton. Michael
Hmm.
Lofton. He's the one that put me in touch with you, so I really appreciate that. Nice guy, yeah.
Oh yeah, Michael's great.
You've
Yeah.
been on once or twice, or how many times have you been on his show?
Geez, I don't remember now. Yeah, it's been a multiple number of times on his
Nice.
on his podcast. So yeah.
Nice. So I'm, for lack of a better term, a young Earth creationist. I believe the whole universe is about 7,222 years old, give or take.
Okay.
That was the tradition of the church until, a couple hundred years ago, with the Roman martyrology. They used to talk about this, the age of the age of the universe, of creation, all these sorts of things. And there are many dogmatic reasons why I took the plunge. I'm just wondering why you haven't, or have you? Do you believe in evolution, or what's your stance on all this stuff?
Yeah. Good. Good question. That's not one I expected, and not frankly not something I really think about.
No?
So no, I don't really have an opinion on it, to be honest with you.
Have you
Yeah.
heard it floating around in conservative circles in the church?
No, the only guess way I've kind of heard about it is not even within the church, but just I mean I know that I thought there was some, and again this is just my very surface understanding of this, but I thought there was some Protestant understandings of
Yeah,
maybe 10,000 years or something of
yeah.
the Earth's
Kent
existence, and
Hovind and people like that. Ken Ham.
yes, but I've never really delved into it or read it or
Okay,
investigated on my own. So yeah, I don't
okay.
really know much about that, but yeah,
Wow,
interesting.
wow.
Mm,
Not even on your radar at all. It's unbelievable.
mm,
Wow.
nope.
So, I mean, you're the kind of guy that when you look into something, you probably look pretty deeply into it. So I'd be interested
Hmm.
to talk to you in a few years hence when you've found the time to sort of take a look. But for me, you know, it's about it's not just about the tradition; it's also about the dogmas of the church. But I'll leave that as an adventure for you, and you may come down on the side of evolution. I don't know, but I you know
love it. Yeah, read Humani Generis many years ago from Pius XII, but
okay.
Yeah, as part of you know, in grad school, but it's been some time since I've delved into that topic, you know, so.
Very interesting. So I do enroll all my guests in a perpetual mass. So it'll be mass being said for you and your family every day till the end of time. And if you end up in purgatory for some strange reason, you'll be benefiting even then. But so in exchange for that, I'd just like you to remember me and my family in your prayers. Okay.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And to come back and chat with me again if you have the time and the inclination.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Great.
It's been a real pleasure. And before we say goodbye, there were probably a couple of things you wanted to say, maybe plug a couple more books or talk about just little ideas that you wanted to share with my small audience. So the floor is yours. Just talk about anything else that we left out that you'd like to touch on.
Oh, yeah, sure. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, we covered a multitude of different books that I've written, and so I appreciate you we're talking about that a little bit. And people can find those on Catholic Answers websites. It's just Catholic.com. Also on Catholic Answers recently, I taped a series of courses on church history. Actually, there's two in their School of Apologetics. They have Introduction to Church History 1 and then Introduction to Church History 2. So these are self-led, you know, taped video kinds of adult learning classes where there's no, you know, you don't get a degree or anything, but you can get a certificate from Catholic Answers for taking these various classes, and they're all on focused on apologetics and defending the faith. It's a very new initiative they've introduced, only a couple of years old now. And just go to Catholic Answers and just type in School of Apologetics, and you should be able to find those classes there. So I would encourage people to go to that and check those out. Very brief summary, kind of survey, you know, aspects of the classes I teach at the graduate school here at Christendom. But if people are interested in actually going further and taking classes for credit and learning at the graduate level, I definitely encourage people to check out christendom.edu. And in particular, look for the graduate school, which is where my courses are offered, and we teach all online. And you can audit the classes if you don't want to, you know, do the research paper or take the midterm and the final. You can definitely take it for just audit and just your general knowledge. We're happy to have students do that as well. Yeah, I write articles occasionally on historical topics for Catholic Answers as well, and that's just on their website, Catholic.com. So check that out occasionally as well, and appreciate the opportunity to talk with you on multitude of interesting different topics, and appreciate the opportunity to plug some things. I
hope it wasn't too awkward when I came with my left field questions. Some of those questions were left field. That's just how I roll.
That's great. It's good. It's very dynamic. Yeah, I like it.
Excellent. So great to meet you. God bless you, and hopefully we'll talk again soon, okay?
Yeah, thank you, David. God bless you.
God bless. Bye.